Time for us to bring you the second part of our debate. We're talking about why Barack Obama and Vladimir Putin will not be meeting and discussing the ramifications for the rest of us. From Syria to Syracuse to Siberia, there's no world story that's not linked to Moscow or to Washington or even to both. Let's bring in our guest then. Oleg Kobzev is professor at the American University of Paris, a specialist in the American-Russian relationship. Oleg, thanks for being with us. On the other side of our studio, Laurie Dundon, former US State Department official and senior fellow at the Partnership for a Secure America. Thank you for being here. Back to the other side of our studio and with us just for a short period in this second half because Elena Servataz is a journalist at RFI's Russia service. She has a program to do round about the end of this program, so halfway through this half, you're off, but you're a specialist on the Magnitsky affair. We'll get your thoughts in a moment. By satellite, we have two guests from Bristol in the United Kingdom. John Laughlin, who's Director of Studies at the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation. John, good to see you. And in Washington, D.C., John Gizzi, the Chief Political Columnist and White House Correspondent for Newsmax. John, good to see you too. Let's talk about the Magnitsky affair and one of the issues that I think could fit into something called, say, human rights and the criminal justice system. I'll bring in you, Elena, because your time is scarce in this half. Tell us about what you've written about the Magnitsky affair and about its implications and ramifications for all of us, really.
I mean, I'm following this case like you already several years, and each time there is something new about Magnitsky, it's become more and more, unbelievable. If you read Kafka or Orwell, this is nothing. Just
let's remind people, Magnitsky was a lawyer.
Magnitsky was a lawyer who said that that the Russian officials, they stole money from Russian budget, 230 million. When he testified against his people, these people put him in a prison, and he stayed in a prison 358 days after he was tortured, and he died. So after this campaign started, United States, they has this law. Now the Europeans wants to discuss the possibility to have this law in Europe. And at the same time, as soon Russia saw that there is a possibility that European Union will react in the same way as United States did, they started the case and they started to judge the dead man. So Sergei Magnitsky was found guilty being dead, and his the chief of Hermitage Capital, he was sentenced to 9 years of prison in Russia.
The idea of convicting someone who is dead does seem somewhat bizarre, almost medieval in terms of British terms. Let's bring in John Laughlin, who's in the UK. John, in terms of talking about why this happened, how this happened, and what it means, it clearly puts Russia in a very, very curious light. I'll be generous. What would you say to that?
I don't agree. I don't agree. I repeat, the Snowden affair was not sought out by Russia. Russia is not seeing to play a human rights card.
No Magnitsky being judged after his death. It's bizarre, isn't it?
I don't know much about the Magnitsky affair. I'd rather not comment on it. I was asked to come on the programme to discuss American relations, and in the light of the Snowden affair, I don't have anything to say about Magnitsky.
Fair enough. We'll leave it on that one then. So in terms of the Snowden affair, in terms of what other things that are happening with human rights, with criminal justice in Russia, would you not say that it's all linked? You know, if these two big giant countries can't put pressure on each other to change things and make things better for the people, there is a link there, isn't there?
Well, as I absolutely agree with you that that human rights has assumed a very important role, a negative role, but it's assumed a major role in the American-Russian and indeed Western-Russian relationship. And I think that is a bad thing because, as was said earlier, there is a lot of hypocrisy around. There is a lot of jingoism, particularly from the United States. We heard completely absurd allegations just now about Russia bullying her neighbours. This is the kind of nonsensical fantasy which we hear from Washington all the time, but which nobody in the world believes.
John, I'll give the guests you're criticising a chance to reply now. Thank you, sir. We appreciate you. John Gizzi in a moment. Laurie here in the studio talking about the Magnitsky law. Tell us about why this was important for the US to establish this.
Well, let me I'll just pick up on the narrative already that's begun and just say that politically, Congress has been quite active on human rights issues in Russia. Congress is particularly strong in their vocality on human rights issues and on trade issues with Russia, and they really hold the reins on those. So while the executive power in the White House continues to make those points in the meetings, a lot of the bilateral discussions that foreign ministry officials have or the White House has is over functional issues, supply lines in Afghanistan, counterterrorism issues, Syria, Iran, the long list of issues, as well as whatever nuclear arms control agreements under negotiation. Congress has been passing these laws, such as on responding to the Magnitsky affair and requiring additional sanctions and whatnot, and it really tightens that noose, sometimes not necessarily on the timetable synchronized with the executive branch, sometimes unhelpful. If you're, let's say, going into a negotiation, this might irk the other side at just the wrong moment, but it's an important part of the U.S. foreign policy. It's strong, it's bold, and I think it'll continue to be even more so now that the White House has said we can't do anything else anyway.
If Snowden came out of the closet, that's a loaded phrase, isn't it? If Snowden came out of the closet, would Russia still grant him asylum? That's the latest tweet from Johnny Nightlife. Thank you, Johnny Nightlife, for that one. I don't know. John, let's bring you back in, John Laughlin, because obviously you're here to talk about this issue. Let's put that question. If Snowden came out of the closet, would Russia still grant him asylum? If he said he was gay, would Russia still grant him asylum?
Of course, this whole gay thing is totally, again, the subject of ridiculous misrepresentations. Homosexuality is legal in Russia. The recent law is an almost exact copy of a law that we had in this country in the United Kingdom between 1988 and 2003. It merely prohibits the promotion of homosexuality to minors. And the idea that there is somehow some kind of persecution of homosexuals in Russia is just absurd as all the other ideas that are constantly bandied around about the lack of civil liberties in that country. I would like to say something about the ideological struggle, because this was a debate we started to have in the first part of the thing. I think there is, it may not be, whether or not it's comparable to the scale of the struggle in the Cold War, that's a moot point, but I think there is an ideological difference between the West and Russia. The West, for a very long time, and indeed since before the end of the Cold War, has embarked on a sort of post-national and I would say post-modern political project in which nation states and other traditional structures like families are regarded as things of the past. And Russia, which of course experimented with leftism for 70 years and which saw itself as the avant-garde progressive country.
That's why there's a perception that Russia basically criticizes, bashes, suppresses homosexuals. I know you say Russia doesn't do that, but is this why there's a perception that happens?
It is, because precisely Russia has not followed the West on this, what I call postmodern, post-family, post-national project, which has engulfed the whole of the West, the United States as much as the European Union.
John, thank
Russia
you. Let
basically
me stop you there,
abandoned.
I've got to get the other guests in as well. Thank you, sir. I think you've made the point very clearly. Elena, you wanted to comment about the homosexual angle.
I think John is dreaming. He's never been to Moscow. Maybe I have
You
a
say
lot
he's
of
dreaming.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a lot of friends in Moscow who are gay, and even just imagine the situation. If I tell my son that I have friends who are gay and they're happy together, it will be considered like a propaganda in front of minors. You cannot be gay in Russia. If you already have adopted children, now they were discussing the possibility to make these people, to put these children in orphanages. If, for example, if I in couple with someone and I am in hospital, this person cannot take care of my child. There is all these kind of issues. I will not speak about how people are beaten, how they are tortured, because there is people think that they're gay. And there is all campaign who was built in Russian social network. People try to catch younger teenagers and they make them testify on the camera, and they're saying that they're gay, and it's really awful. After this video goes to their teachers, parents, and it's really awful.
Sadly, gay bashing, as it gets called, exists everywhere. There was a case here in Paris of a young gay man being beaten up. So I have to point that out. Obviously, you're telling us what your experience is and what you saw.
Right.
Let me bring in John Gizzi just for a comment about because John Laughlin, John Gizzi was saying that your claims about oppression in the neighbouring states in Russia was nonsense. I'll give you a right to reply to that one. John Gizzi.
All right, thank you, Mark. I would just say, with respect to John Laughlin, he should tune in sometime to the France 24 interview when the daughter of the jailed Madame Tymoshenko is a guest, and she is frequently spelled out right in the studio you're in, the persecution and the heavy-handedness in her country that's coming from the Putin regime in Moscow. And I dare say that if it were not for Russian influence in Ukraine, maybe Mr. Yanukovych would not be in power, and just maybe Georgia would still be whole again. Now, I will also point out the Magnitsky affair is very important, but please also let's couple it with the story of Alexei Navalny, the blogger who could very well be a threat to Mr. Putin in a fair election someday, and what he's gone through in being silenced in court.
John Laughlin, you're shaking your head. Give us your first reaction to that issue of Navalny.
Yeah, this is absolute rubbish. We debated Navalny last week, 10 days ago. Navalny has not been silenced. He's been convicted of embezzlement, but he's been released on appeal. And he is free to contest the Moscow City
Why is
elections.
there always a
and he's
sense
also
that
not a
there's
threat
been
to Putin.
some kind of
Can I reply on
political twisting
Tymoshenko?
on that? Well, you can. Go ahead. You go ahead.
Yeah. Again, this is fantasy. You know, let's get a reality check. Mrs. Tymoshenko was convicted in Ukraine for being excessively pro-Russian. That's the madness of the whole thing. The idea that Russia was behind the prosecution of Yulia Tymoshenko is completely absurd. And the idea that Yanukovych is supported or is in power only because of Russia is equally absurd. You know, these are fantasies, and they are part of the ideological problem dividing Russia and America. And for as long as people believe these fantasies, the relationship will never recover.
Can we move on to one issue that I think is very much on people's minds? That is the issue of Syria, and the fact, of course, that the US is on one side of this equation and Russia is the only ally of any weight supporting Syria. I'll start here in the studio first on this one. I'll start with Oleg. In terms of solving this problem or moving towards a resolution of this problem, if the US and Russia aren't talking, there's clearly going to be no advance on that issue.
Absolutely not. Well, it's a few days ago we debated that issue with Annette O'Toole right here in the studio, and the picture is very bleak because it's already leading towards disaster, with probably Assad standing on a heap of rubble saying, yeah, I won, because America and Russia are not talking to each other. Congratulations.
Can I get a quick word from Elena before you go and do your day job?
Let's keep counting how many human rights violations there are. Let's have the Americans count how many violations of human rights there are in Russia, and the Russians do the same in their press because they do that very often themselves. And let's keep that up and not talk to each other and go to disaster.
Elena, in terms of what's being said from via the Russian service, what you're picking up from Russia, any feeling among the people there that they'd like a change in state policy, perhaps towards Syria?
I mean, people.
Yeah.
Russian people.
The people you speak to, yeah.
Of course, everybody understands why Putin doesn't want this happen, why there is all this veto. As soon as Putin sees a regime falling, he thinks and he knows the next one he will be. Okay. So that is a problem. You cannot treat Putin like any other leader. You should not discuss, or you should not do this, because you're absolutely sure that he will. The New York Senator Charles Schumer told that he's a school hooligan. I'm really sure he is.
Okay, Elena, thank you very much indeed. Laurie?
Just on Syria, I think it's a perfect case to look at how the complexities of this relationship might play out in the next months ahead. Just like Snowden was a big political message, and there was a big political response of calling out the summit, while the symbolic moves and at the top level, things are going to be chilled for quite a while, I think you'll still see the second level down trying to work very intensely together, and they may actually be able to get things done in different ways. For example, the Saudi Arabians, Saudis are playing a very interesting role right now, working with the Americans, working with others in the Friends of Syria group to try to navigate the opposition and the outside parties in the direction they want to go. And when they sent an emissary to Moscow and said, you know, we'll offer you some benefits if you pull back from Assad a little bit, if you support more in the UN Security Council resolution, it's the same message that Washington may be sending, but it's coming from a different voice. And it's going to be a lot of these same actors moving around the same puzzle pieces, still with a lot of obstacles ahead on Syria, no clear win and the trajectory to come, but not necessarily frozen dead.
Laurie, thank you. Let me reassure the two Johns, that Lachlan and Gizzy, that you'll be back in a moment. Now we take a brief pause in the debate and bring in James Creedon, who is our media editor here at François Picard, to see what he's found on this issue on the internet. Go ahead, James.
Evening, Mark. Interesting to look at the reaction in the US and Russian press about this Cold War mentality, that expression that Obama used on the Jay Leno show 2 nights ago. That was picked up widely as a headline in the US press. For the Washington Post, it's good that for once Obama respected a red line from their point of view. He's issued a number of red lines in the past, for example, chemical weapons in Syria.
That's a phrase that's going to haunt him, isn't it?
Right.
Red line, yeah.
And they're pleased to see him respecting that red line. Now, if you move to Bloomberg, they've done a nice little press review of the Russian press, which helped me quite a lot, Mark. Now, some of the things that they picked up on, Gazeta on Twitter, they sort of made light of this whole issue and mocked Obama, saying, Obama won't see Putin because Putin is already seeing Snowden, almost treating him as a jilted lover. Elsewhere in the Russian press, it's seen as a sign of weakness. Why didn't he cancel the entire G20 meeting, or his presence at the G20 meeting? The dominant theory is that that Obama didn't necessarily want to make these hostile moves, but felt under domestic pressure to do so. Elsewhere, a pro-Putin newspaper editor, Vitaly Tredyaikov, said that Russia, strictly speaking, does not care. What could we expect from Obama's visit? A second reset, but the first one failed. A second détente, but who even remembers the first one? Now, elsewhere, liberal Putin opponents in Russia also seem a little bit disappointed because they feel that it should have been human rights violations in Russia, not necessarily rights violations in the US, that would have triggered this this particular attitude. Which brings me, I suppose, to Stephen Fry's stance.
Stephen Fry, that's the British actor, yeah?
That's right. Now, he sent an open letter to David Cameron, basically saying, and Obama has raised this issue as well, of the Sochi Olympics, the Winter Olympics. Russia, given their stance on gay rights,
said to be the most expensive Olympics ever.
That's right.
That has to be added, yeah?
That's right. So Stephen Fry took his argument very far and basically said that gays in Russia are being treated as Jews under Hitler, and that it is simply unacceptable that Russia should host the Winter Olympics next year.
We've had that refuted by John Lachlan already, but we'll give him a chance to come back to that.
That's right. Now, elsewhere in Forbes magazine, Mark Adomanis says really the problem with Stephen Fry's letter is that it was sincere but very confused. That it plays into this notion that the West is always progressive, the East is superstitious and regressive, and that it's a lot more complicated than that. That Russia has imported positive ideas from the West, such as modern medicine, and negative ideas such as Marxism, even though that suggests that homosexuality is an idea being imported. So I'm not sure if all of the points in that article are valid. Elsewhere, Vancouver hoping to benefit from that, some having launched a petition that Vancouver would host the Winter Olympics instead of Sochi.
That's a possibility. James, we need to leave it there.
A vague one, I would say.
Thank you very much indeed. James Creedon with his usual insight and, variety of issues that are very interesting. That issue about the Russian people importing interesting ideas. I did a report once about use of photodynamic therapy, which involved injecting chlorophyll into tumours and hitting it with a laser, and it turned out to be something which didn't quite work, but it was taken by a doctor in London and turned into something which did work and is actually helping a lot of people. That began in Russia, so there we go. Maybe there's room for development. Let's bring in the two Johns, that's Lachlan and Gizzy, who are joining us from Bristol in the UK and Washington, respectively, and take up where we were talking before about the Syrian issue. Starting with John Lachlan, if the US and Russia don't talk, how can there be any progress on Syria, sir?
Well, let's not forget that actually they are, of course, continuing to talk. I mean, the fact that a bilateral meeting has been cancelled doesn't mean they're not talking. They will see each other, and obviously other diplomatic links continue. I agree that an agreement between them would be very good for Syria. But the key issue in the Syrian problem is not, in my view, the Russian support for Assad, as it is caricatured. That's a caricature of the Russian position. But that's not the key issue. The key issue in the Syrian conflict is that the West's policy is failing there. The West has come into the Syrian conflict, which was basically an intra-Arab and intra-Muslim struggle, which blew up into violence 2 years ago. And the West unequivocally took the side of the rebels, and its policy has failed. It has been unable, as we know, to get the opposition to agree. It realizes that much of the opposition, if not most of it, is dominated by Islamists, and very violent ones at that. That is the real issue in the Syrian case. It's not the fact that Russia is doing this or that. It's that the idea of a democratic revolution in Syria, which is the backbone of Western policy in that country, is complete nonsense.
The weapons, of course, being used by Assad's armies undeniably are from Russia. That is a fact. People here in the studio agreeing with what you were saying there, John, to be honest. Let's bring in John Gizzi, who might have a different perspective on this. The West and its policy in Syria, would you agree, John Gizzi, that it's actually failing?
At this point, the momentum certainly isn't taking off. But at the same time, this has gone back and forth, back and forth. And I know that the White House Press Secretary Jay Carney has never wavered from the official line that Assad is on the wrong side of history. Were he to survive in a Peloponnesian War kind of triumph, he would simply be a pariah in the rest of the world, as would Syria. My own guess will be that eventually the Free Syrian Army will be united and come together. And as for John's remark that it's totally dominated by Islamists, that flies in the face of every report which says it's 60% secular, 40% Islamicist right now. And that was the report that Senator McCain gave when he came back from meeting with them at their meeting in exile. No, it is a long, hard road. Russia's vetoed aid 3 times at the United Nations, vetoed resolutions that might have ended this a long time ago. But again, freedom is a hard thing to tamp down.
John, as you were speaking, John Loughlin, I think, predictably shaking his head. Let's give you a tweet that's just come in here from Kibble119. So let me get this right. He says, Obama cancelled a meeting with Putin and the Russians are the ones blocking diplomacy. There you go. Laurie, anything to say on that one?
Well, I think it's been said a couple times in the conversation that the diplomacy is going to continue. It's just going to continue at different levels. In fact, I think actually ministers are supposed to meet. Secretary Kerry and Secretary Hagel are having meetings with senior Russian officials tomorrow already again. So the work will continue. The tone will be tense.
Sure.
The challenges, like Syria, are just as hard as they were yesterday.
And there are so many out there. Syria, Iran, we could go on for a long list.
Right. And on Iran issues, I think we're facing an interesting couple of months ahead. Now that Rouhani has opened the door for more serious negotiations, or offering more serious negotiations, you're going to very quickly get to conversations within the P5+1 group, the UN Security Council 5, Permanent 5 plus Germany, saying, okay, if we open up negotiations, now what do we want to put back on the table? And that means the US, Russia, all the same parties going back to the desk, working these same topics, and a lot of tough things on the agenda in the next couple of months.
Oleg?
What can they say to each other? All right, conversations are continuing, but they have a choice between a bloody dictatorship supported by Russia and
Syria.
a bloody anarchy caused by the United States' belief that it can build some kind of democratic regime
depressing
there.
options, aren't they?
So what are they what are they going to talk about, and how will these conversations end?
Do you see more optimism in Iran, though?
Now, this is where it's important to have human rights. If human rights were as important in the United States as the American government claims they are, and if the Kremlin actually respected and committed to human rights, and I would like to remind that the USSR is a signatory of the 1948 Universal Declaration, of the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So there should be a commitment. We wouldn't be in this mess. There would be something to build upon.
We're running out of time. Let me bring in John Loughlin for possibly a final comment from you, John, in terms of the human rights issue there. Russia has a lot to do. That's the basic message we're getting here.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, that's the caricature, isn't it? That is the caricature
There
which
is truth in it, they're
instrumentalized. Who is saying that?
Our guests.
Well, I've heard different points of view. Some of them have said it, but in my view, it is largely exaggerated and largely a caricature. On certain issues, there is a greater freedom of expression in Russia than there is in the West. The West, the political discourse in the West. Political discourse in the West has narrowed
Not now, it's changed.
and is narrowing. Russia, after obviously 70 years of dictatorship, has experienced and is continuing to experience a freedom which in some respects, not in all, but in some respects, we don't enjoy in the West anymore.
John Laughlin,
that's been said to me not just by...
I need to pause you there, sir. I'm very sorry, we're out of time. John Laughlin joining us there from down the line from Bristol, from the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation. Thanks to John Gizzi, who I hope to get back to a final word, but sadly time against us. John, thank you very much for joining us, the White House correspondent there in Washington. Our guests here in the studio too, Oleg Kopsev and Laurie Dundon, thank you both for joining us. And thank you for watching. This has been the France 24 debate. Do stay with us.